the lesson tonight. We've got quite a bit of material to cover tonight and tomorrow. And it's kind of strange how we'd kind of set aside the Torah portions for a few weeks to finish up this information from the Song of Songs. And yet again, it's lining up like Toldot did last week with the explanation of Esau and the appetite of the beast and so forth. And in the week before, again, with the interaction between Rebecca and Isaac. So this week, what I noticed is the passage that I went back to demonstrate a particular principle. It was quoted directly out of this week's Torah portion, which is by Yitzhak. So it's lining itself up. So somehow this is what's happening. So let me share my screen with you. And if you didn't catch this last week, this is a good lesson to go back and reference. And it's from 2020. It's called the International Mezuzah, which it's, of course, going to be on a much bigger scale than what we're going to talk about tonight, or what we talked about last week, as it concerns the lintel, the doorposts, and even the threshold. We're kind of looking at this as a threshold covenant, because when you're talking about a threshold covenant, of course, it's going to include the doorposts and the lintels, as it concerns the sacrifice. And so this is the picture on the right is the mezuzah. It's made out of uncut stone. And this is at Hebron. And this particular side of the building is where you can go and visit at least the upper level of the tombs of Abraham and Sarah. And then this one you can read on the mezuzah, if you can read the Hebrew, it says Jacob and Leah, or Yaakov and Leah. And of course, it's got the traditional Hebrew letter Shin inscribed into it. And in modern terminology, we have a particular view of what a mezuzah would look like. Now, this particular mezuzah is a little bit different than what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing them highly decorated, maybe. It's a great opportunity for artists a lot of times. I've seen them even made out of the glass shards from the glass that's broken at the wedding ceremony. And they'll fill up the little case with the glass shards from that and create a mezuzah out of it. So what you're used to seeing today in a highly decorated casing with a little parchment inside, it might be a little more refined, perhaps, than what was around in the first century when Yeshua was walking around. Nobody knows exactly when the mezuzah came to have the form that we'd see today, where it's not, if you read the passage about a mezuzah, you might get the idea that you're literally supposed to write all the commandments on your doorpost, which you would have to be able to write very tiny. And but in this case, it's in a case. It's in a protective case that is attached to the doorpost, and you can see the proper mounting, or the traditional mounting, even with this uncut stone. This is about 3/4 of the way up that particular door. And of course, it's aimed slightly inward, pointing inward to the grave sites. So, like I say, history doesn't tell us exactly when they decided that this was how the commandment would be observed, to write the commandments on your doorpost. What we do know from archaeology is that this particular method of obeying the commandment, putting the commandments inside some sort of case, and then affixing that to the door, to where the case itself came to be called the mezuzah, whereas the doorpost is the mezuzah. And so a mezuzah is both a mezuzah case with the parchment inside, as well as a doorpost. And like I said, we know it was in use during the time of the Qumran community. And we also know it was in use in the Second Temple period when Yeshua ministered. How far it predates that, I don't think anybody can really tell. This is just how it came to be observed. And so we want to break this down, because remember last week we were talking quite a bit about, the blood of the lamb on the doorposts, talking about the covenant, the slaughtering there at the doorpost of the house, and how significant that was in terms of covenant, and how sharing in that sacrifice, eating a portion from that sacrifice, bonded you, not just to that family, but to that covenant. You were binding as a community of like kind and like mind when you partook of that sacrifice, just like it says, in Exodus, that if there's not enough people in a particular household, then you basically sign up people so that there are enough people sharing in a lamb that everybody can have at least one bite. And so, as I remember, it would be around 40 people who would register for one lamb for Passover. So that tells you about how many people a lamb would feed on Passover. But where did this word come from? Its root is going to be ziz. And so let's look at the meaning of that. Ziz is moving creatures. Not just creatures, it's moving creatures. And in fact, on day 6 of creation, it talks about moving creatures. And that's what we want to look at next, is why these sacrifices? What's going on with the sacrifice? Sometimes we have a kind of a nebulous idea of what's going on with the sacrifice. It just seems like a lot of blood and guts and gore and skinning things. And, having not lived in that time period, it seems a little remote to us, even though, most of us are down for a good barbecue. We don't always make that leap because we don't slaughter our own animals. So it never hurts to kind of go back and look at, why were there sacrifices? What kind of information can we get from the scriptures that tells us why an animal sacrifice would be so important to your worship? And so the root of mezuzah is a word that doesn't seem to have a thing to do with a mezuzah. It says a moving creature, something that's abundant. It's a wild beast. It can also refer to collective moving things, like the beast on the 6th day, every moving thing. It might be something that moves to and fro in an agitative way. If you go back into a sister language of Assyrian, it speaks collectively of reptiles. Of course, reptiles are things we don't eat. But when you look at this, moving creatures, moving things, the idea that the basic meaning is that it's something conspicuous. So these aren't animals camouflaged in the forest. These are animals very much in evidence, because they're not just moving, they tend to move in large numbers. So let's just figure out if the root of it here is ziz, and you'll notice it's spelled the same way backward and forward. It's a palindrome. We want to apply a little bit of Hebrew grammar here. And so if you're going to make mezuzah out of ziz, then you have to add the Hebrew letter mem as a prefix. And so ziz becomes mezuzah. And the or the he at the end, that's telling you, it's signaling you that it's a feminine noun. Hebrew words are either masculine or feminine, like say Spanish. And that way you know how to make it plural. So the plural of mezuzah is going to be mezuzot, mezuzot. And applying that grammar principle, like what is happening when you put a mem in front of a noun? Well, typically it's going to signal that this object, like a menorah, ner is a light, a menorah is the means by which the light is accomplished. It's from the light. It's from this great thing called light, but see there with a menorah, with a lamp, from this great thing called light, you have the means by which light can be brought into this smaller place. The lamp itself is the means by which the light is able to project. So if you take that example and you just move it over here to Z's and turn it into mezuzah, then we have a couple of choices here. We could say it's the means by which living things move, which doesn't sound really like that's working, but it could be the means from which living things move. It's all about the movement here. And at its heart, of course, it has to do with a wild beast. If you want to use it as an imperative to a male, you would say zuz. That means move it. If you tell a female the same thing, you say zuzi, move it. And so it's the mezuzah is all about motion, which is really odd because a mezuzah is typically not a moving mezuzah. Once you nail it up there, it's there. It's not going to move unless somebody intentionally removes it. It's pretty well fixed in place. So it seems to have a name that means the opposite of what it is. And remember too, it's not just the case with the parchment in it that's called a mezuzah. Even before that, it's the doorpost, which is a mezuzah. And it's even odder when you think of it in terms of a doorpost, because are we going to say that a doorpost is the means from which living things move? Possibly so. That's why it's going to help clarify why you would have sacrifices at a doorpost, for instance, like a Passover lamb, or like the example we looked at last week of the Nestorian or the Assyrian Christians who kept that custom even up into the 1800s, that when they sacrificed a lamb, they would either do it at the doorpost of the church, or if they did it at their own home, from there they would have to send out portions because it was a type of a fellowship sacrifice. So in a nutshell, if we look at a mezuzah as the case that fits on the door with the parchment in it that has the commandments, it's like putting the blood of the lamb on your doorpost. It's going to be a sign of covenant relationship, and it's going to be a visible sign. In a perfect world, the whole world would be able to see it if they walked by the front door of your house. And because it is a sign of a covenant relationship, and because it is specifically connected to a meal at its first mention, then we can say having a mezuzah on your doorpost, that's an outward sign that what is going on inside of the house each week is a Shabbat meal. Actually, there should be 3 Shabbat meals. It's called Seudat Shabbat, or it's called the Order of Shabbat. And so it's considered good form to eat at least 3 meals, either in your home or someone else's home on Shabbat. It's not the day to diet. And so as you eat those Shabbat meals, remember last week, the sign we talked about was Shabbat. It kept popping up in the context. Turn back to Shabbat. How do you survive the wilderness? Get back into Shabbat, because it's going to teach you the lessons that will preserve you in the wilderness. And so seeing a mezuzah on a doorpost is a pretty good sign that those covenant meals of Shabbat are being consumed inside of it every week. And this is where maybe we can begin to kind of unpack why the word mezuzah seems not to really fit what a doorpost is or the commandments on the doorpost are. The signal here is that outside in the world, there's all sorts of wild beasts. There's all sorts of moving creatures. And those creatures are animals of instinct. They eat whatever it is that they're designed to eat, whether it's grass, whether it's other animals, whether it's grains, insects, worms, whatever it is that those wild moving beasts eat. What's good for food for them is outside of your house. You don't want wild animals consuming what is inside your house. That's why they make mouse traps and all sorts of things to discourage the wild beasts from consuming things in your house that they might think are good for food. Because what's good for a beast to eat is outside your house. When we're talking about a wild beast, please keep feeding your puppies and your kitty cats and your goldfish. But the human beings inside the mezuzah, the human beings inside the home, the signal there is this family is eating within those commandments that are written on the mezuzot. So as human beings, they are distinguished from those moving wild animals out there. What's good for food for the human beings inside is not the same as what is good for food for the wild beasts outside. There's a distinction between these two. And so the mezuzah becomes this sign of submission to the creator of all things. It goes back to the garden. Are we going to eat whatever we think is good for food, whatever our eyes tell us is good for food? Or are we going to eat what the creator says is good for food? When we look at the mezuzah, that's part of the equation that we should be seeing. Because what the mezuzah does is it separates the man and the beast. And so you can kind of see now how that particular root, a moving wild beast, is really good when we think of a mezuzah, because if we look at the mezuzah, it will remind us that in the Father's house are human beings. Out in the field are the beasts of the field. And if man goes out into the field, the mezuzah is there to remind him of his behavior, that he is not a beast of the field, that he is a human being. And so whether he goes out or whether he comes in, those doorposts, the commandments remind him to separate himself from the beast. And there's lots of play on words as we get into this. The Hebrew word for from is min. And so it's typically shortened if it's going to be used as a prefix like it is in mezuzah. We don't say minzuzah. We don't say minziz. It transforms the word a little bit. So you're going to drop the noon out of min. You're going to affix the mem to the beginning. You're going to transform it into its feminine gender, and it's going to become mezuzah. But if we look at Z's, the moving wild beast, I gave you a couple of examples here so that it would be a little clear what kind of function this mezuzah is serving by being fastened very securely to your doorpost. In Psalm 50:11, it says, I know every bird of the mountains and everything that moves in the field is mine. In other words, all of these moving creatures, they are mine. He is the creator. And the idea here is their location is in the field. They're not in your house. They're not food for you in your house. There might be some clean creatures among those in the field, but the mezuzah is going to separate for you what can be brought in as food and what cannot. And then Psalm 80, verse 13 says, a boar, a pig, from the forest eats it away, and whatever moves in the field feeds on it. The context here is it's comparing it to a pig that'll pretty much eat anything, including a human being. You just put it in front of a pig and it's not going to turn its nose up. And so he's using a comparison here, just like a pig eats anything. And by the same token, the Z's, the moving beast of the field, will feed on just about anything. They feed in the same manner. And so as they developed looking at passages that use Z's to describe the moving animals, they could see that these are things in the field with unrestrained appetites. Unrestrained appetites. And if you'll remember last week, what did Esau have? An unrestrained appetite. And we're going to look how we know that he was functioning instead of like a human being on this side of the mezuzah. He was behaving like a ziz. He was behaving like one of these moving things of the field because he was specifically called a man of the field. He liked to hunt. He was like the beasts of the field. He was predatory. So before we get into that, let's take a little side path here. Let's walk around the pond for a second. Let's go back to why we bring sacrifices, because remember, the mezuzah, the lintel, and even the threshold, these are all form part of your door. And so the door makes a distinction. This is why you're going to bring sacrifices to the door. Now, once the temple is built, you bring a sacrifice to the temple. What was your personal door now becomes your collective door on the Temple Mount. But it goes back to the sixth day of creation so that you can see that at the beginning, it was intended that there be a distinction between the two of us, between human beings and wild beasts. Genesis 1:24 says, then God said, let the earth produce living creatures according to their kind, livestock and crawling things and animals of the earth according to their kind. And it was so. God made the animals of the earth according to their kind, and the livestock according to their kind, and everything that crawls on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. We see that the beasts behave and reproduce according to their kind. That Hebrew word there for a kind or a species is min. And that should sound familiar because we just used it as a prefix for mezuzah. And so the mezuzah reminds us that we should eat, reproduce, behave according to our kind, not the kind of the beast. It's only good when they behave according to their kind. Now notice the shift here. This is on the 6th day of creation. This explains the 666 for you in its most primitive form. Then God said, there's a change here. We're still on the 6th day of creation. And this is why the number of a man is also the number of a beast. They were both created on the same day. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, according to our likeness. This is a different word here. He's not even using the word species. He's not using mean. He says, let them rule over the fish of the sea. The idea here is the beasts are according to a mean, according to a species, according to a kind. You see that mezuzah, and it reminds you that the wild beasts, their kind is outside your house. You don't bring the beast and its kind, its behavior inside your house in order for you to imitate, because you were made differently, not even with that same word. The moving things are outside, the creepy things, the reptile things, the things that devour without consideration, without thought. You are made according to an image and according to a likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every crawling thing that crawls on the earth. These are the Z's, the crawling things, the creepy things, the moving things. And so because you were made in the image of Elohim, you are not a Z's. You should never confuse yourself with the Z's, even though you're created on the very same day. It says, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So that's the idea. Those inside the house on this side of the mezuzah rule over those moving things outside of the house, outside of the mezuzah. You're still in one world, but there's a principle of your home, this protected area that distinguishes you from the Z's, to remind you through those commandments to rule over the Z's so that you will never be Esau, so that your appetite will never rule you. That's just like I said, that's the paleo prophecy of the older serving the younger, because the older of this day are the moving things, the beasts. The younger of this day, created last, is going to be mankind. But the pattern is that the younger mankind was created to rule over the older, the beasts. Jacob was created to rule over Esau, who was red and hairy all over like a beast. Just real simple prophecy there. And so this is, a lot of times people get into Revelation 13:18, where it says, here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number is 666, which is an intensive number. In other words, get back to day 6, go back to the first mention of the number 6. And if you didn't think the 6 was going to help you, he says 666. You go back to the earliest mention of the 6, and it's going to give you a key to understanding why the number of the beast is that of a man, because they were both created on the 6th day. And what you need to know about your behavior in its elemental form is given to you on the 6th day of creation. You are supposed to rule over your beastly nature. You're supposed to rule over your Esau, and Esau is not supposed to rule over you. Your appetite is not supposed to rule over you. So let's look at this threshold covenant of moving creatures, threshold including every lesson the doorway is teaching us. And I took this out of the Sefer HaChinuk, section 116. I want to read to you a few entries from the Sefer HaChinuk, and all that is a list of the 613 commandments with a brief explanation of how you do it and the rationale behind it. And so what this is going to do is give us the rationale behind animal sacrifice, right? Because remember, the lamb is sacrificed there at the threshold. And then in temple times, tabernacle times, we move that lamb into the holier space of you take it to the doorway of the tabernacle, and that's where you slaughter it, or you take it to a specified place in the temple and you slaughter it. Nobody does it for you. You do it for yourself. So this animal being slain at the doorway is to remind you that it's part of a threshold covenant. You who are inside the house, or you who are inside the temple, the house is a metaphor for the temple, the human beings inside the house, the living creatures in the fields surrounding it, but you not passing out into the field to try to conform to their kind or to their mean. And so here's what the Sefer says about animal sacrifice. It says, an offering of a living creature is truly intended to show a strong semblance to the human being. Remember, they're created on the same day, so there is a strong resemblance. He says, this is in order to subdue and abase the craving and sinning soul. For sin derives from nothing but a beastly animal root. So here we have a very easy explanation that we can pass on to our kids when we're trying to teach them Torah and they're looking at us with crossed eyes because they don't understand all the blood and the guts and the gore and why this innocent little, creature has to die because somebody sinned. This is one of the most concise explanations I've ever found for what this particular mode of sacrifice does. When you offer a living creature, it represents you, because whatever behavior it is that you're atoning for with this animal, it's because you conformed yourself to the kind of that animal. You did not conform yourself to the image of Elohim. You functioned like Esau. You did not subdue your craving. You didn't humble that sinning soul. And he says where this is coming from, it's coming from this beastly animal root, because this is what we have in common with a beast. We both have a soul. We both have a nefesh. In fact, in the Sefer, the English translation translated it spirit, and spirit's not the best translation for nefesh. Ruach is better for spirit, maybe neshama, but nefesh, it's the animal soul. But we are not the totality of animal soul. We have the Ruach Elohim, we have the spirit of Elohim in us that distinguishes us, that gives us admittance to the house, because our behavior is different from those moving things on the other side of the mezuzah. And so this is what the commentator is saying. You bring this living creature because you behaved like this living creature. You didn't elevate yourself up from the level of the beast. And it goes back to the sixth day of creation. Did you behave like a beast? Or did you do what Elohim told you to do, to conform yourself to his image? So this is getting down to day 6. So if we say, why is in Revelation, why does it keep talking about 666? Why does it keep talking about man and beast? This is why. It's taking you all the way back to the beginning. So it's not really showing you new information. It's showing you how this is finally being resolved, how the animal nature, the beast, is finally being subdued among mankind. This entry comes from section 120. It says one of the purposes of an offering is to subdue the, did I explain all of that? Okay. The wisdom in Hebrew and that passage in Revelation I just quoted, where it says, here's wisdom. If you put that back into Hebrew, it's chokhmah. It's not the type of wisdom I'm about to talk about. This is a different kind of wisdom. It says one of the purposes of an offering is to subdue the appetitive, right? Remember what we said a nefesh is. If you've done workbook 4, you know that the nefesh, it's appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. Right? And the intellect might throw you here for just a second. That's why I put a little asterisk. So you wouldn't think it was like the intelligence, where you wouldn't confuse those two. Anyway, when you bring an animal sacrifice, it's because there is some human appetite that was out of control, was not subdued. There was some desire of the soul, like Adam and Eve looking at this fruit saying, oh, it's beautiful, it's good, it's going to make us wise, it's going to make us all these things. Well, that desire was out of control. And they obeyed the doctrine of a beast of the field rather than obeying the commandment of the Holy One. So the animal sacrifice is there to subdue the desire of the nefesh, of the soul. And at the very same time, what they want to do is amplify the spirit of intelligence. Now, like I said, let me explain what kind of intelligence they're talking about. This is nefesh, the soul, ha-sichlit. Ha-sichlit. So it's not chokhmah, it's not bina, it's not da'at, if you've done workbook 1. It's none of those described in the 7 spirits of Adonai. This is a different kind of wisdom. It's intelligence in the sense of information gathering, like that's even in a modern use. If we have an intelligence service, then it's somebody who is collecting information. You know, it might be domestically, they might be collecting military intelligence, they might be collecting technology intelligence, but it's acquiring information in a patient, prudent way in order to make a good decision. That's the kind of intelligence we're talking about when we say sichlit. It's not instinct. It's not your IQ, how smart you are, though it didn't hurt to be smart. But it has to do with this methodical, patient information gathering in order to make a good decision. You can see that this is not what Adam and Eve did. They thought that's what they were doing. They told themselves. That's more often the case, right? We tell ourselves that's what we're doing. They told themselves that's what they were doing, but it was not what they did. They did not patiently wait until the cool of the evening to make a decision. They made it in the heat of the day. And so it didn't qualify as hasichlit. So when you bring an animal sacrifice, it reminds you, don't just rush out there. Don't be impulsive. Don't believe the first thing you hear. Don't believe it because you saw it on the internet. Please don't believe it because you saw it on the internet. I get the craziest stuff. Is this true? I'm like, oh, good grief. But this is part of the plan. We have all this information available to us in this generation. And so more than ever, we need to cultivate what an animal sacrifice was designed to do, which is to slow us down. Verify, collect your intelligence, cross-reference, interview. Don't just rush out there, make a decision and post something, write something, say something, because it could be you're passing on something that's wrong or wrongly applied. And this is what we see with Eve. she took the information that the serpent gave her and she wrongly applied it to her dilemma. She acted too quickly. And so it says, there they are to present the sacrifice of an offering, thus repairing their heart through the force of this activity, the defect of the erring animalistic spirit and the eminence of the intelligent spirit. Remember, the one that's patient, sichlit, the one that gathers information and makes a considered choice. And in the case of Adam and Eve, if they were truly wanting to consider their route, the smart thing to do is say, well, Mr. Serpent, why don't you check back with us tomorrow? Because we're going to talk with Elohim tonight, and we'll get back with you on that. And they didn't do that. And so he says, through sacrifice, it's to slow us down and remind us that we can rectify this through sacrifice. Now, when we think of what Yeshua had to go through in order to slow us down, so we wouldn't behave like the Z's, like we wouldn't be running to and fro like a beast, just devouring every bit of intelligence we could possibly swallow in a day. You don't have to do that. There's no rule that says you have to swallow everything that's offered to you. And if you're using the internet, it's extra effort, but you can learn how to shut things down where you're not getting as many emails. You can shut things down on your cell phone. Yeah. Where you're not, it's hard to screen out the spam. You can mute your phone, but there's settings. You have to really search it out and say, you know what, I can cut off some of this noise. If it's something I have to have, there are still ways to cut off the excessive noise so that I can make considered decisions. I can gather intelligence and not take a shortcut. And I'm going to give you an example of how it can be perceived as a shortcut. Genesis 3:6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. So you notice there that it's not Chokhmah. That is not one of the seven spirits of Adonai she's seeking. She is seeking lehaskil. Lehaskil. That's the verb form of the noun we're talking about, hasichlit. And she says, oh, look, this thing that will make me patient, will give me this framework for patiently gathering intelligence before I make a decision. There's actually a shortcut to that. I can do it faster. When its very meaning is, no, it's not faster, it's slower. It is more considered. It's not impulsive. It's not like a serpent. It's not like a beast of the field. You're not a gobbler. You're not here to just gobble up everything in front of you. You are supposed to be sechal. You are supposed to be prudent, circumspect, to wisely understand and to prosper in that. And what the serpent is saying, oh, look, a shortcut to sechal. You know what? A shortcut to prosperity. Because see, if you take the time to exercise lehaskil, then those decisions tend to prosper because they're considered, they're not impulsive. And so if you want to practice sichlit or to be sechal, guess what, folks? There's no shortcut and there never has been. There never has been. We have here the first prosperity preacher in the garden. Oh, look how fast you can acquire patience. Oh, look how fast you can acquire understanding. And it's just, if you've been around a while, this is true. You'll never know as much about the Torah as you knew when you had learned for 3 years. You were just so sure that you have it mastered. And then the longer you study Torah, the less you realize you're not even scratching the surface. And you understand as you lay down these layers and foundations year after year after year of Torah study, and you see what it's building in your life, you realize there was no shortcut, because you couldn't attain the level you were at unless you had first attained through patience and prudence and understanding this level, this level, this level, this level, this level, because there's no way he could have shown you this if you didn't know that. And that's the beauty. At some point you realize, well, there's no telling what I'll be able to understand if I would just be patient and not try to acquire and to force too fast. I see that a lot. People get excited about the word, but then they try forcing things and they make up crazy stuff with Hebrew words. And you don't even know a nice way to tell them sometimes. You've outrun your maturity level in the word, or you've outrun your skill level in Hebrew. Slow down, just slow down. Never make that decision in the heat of the day that'll wait until the cool of the evening. Because that's what Adam and Eve did. They took their shortcut. And what did they do? They devoured the fruit, just like a beast, at the suggestion of a beast. That's what a beast does. It just devours. It doesn't measure its food against the Creator's commandment. It works on instinct. Human beings were not created to eat on instinct. They were given a commandment. This is what I give you to eat. This is what I don't give you to eat. And you were to measure what goes in your mouth against that commandment in a patient, intelligence gathering way, which we do to this day. If I were to follow every one of you around the grocery store, I would see you doing exactly this. You would be sechal. You would be wise. I would see you picking up foods if it wasn't a familiar brand, and you would be checking the label to see what the ingredients were. Is this human food or is this moving beast food? And I would see you make your decision. That's okay. You'd put it in your buggy. You pick up something else. Ooh, no, we can't have that. And you would put that back up on the shelf. You were patient. You realized that there was no shortcut to finding out what was inside those cans or bags. And so these sacrifices are there to kind of slow us down and to make us circumspect about our behavior, saying, you know what, this is what I acted like, but this is not who I was created to be. I acted like what was on the other side of that mezuzah, a living, moving, wild beast. And a beast is alive, it's just not a human being. But I was created to be a human being, to function in the Father's house, that I would never bring things inside of his house that weren't on the approved list. And I have to learn that list with patience. There's no shortcut. And with these sacrifices, they would offer it with salt. And the idea here is that if this beast is being offered to signify that this was my behavior, however, I want my behavior to be transformed from beast to human, you add the salt with it in order to preserve the change. The salt preserves the change represented by the animal sacrifice. So, and it's very brief where we read about salt. Leviticus, I think it's 2:13, if I didn't mistype it. It talks about offering with salt, that you shouldn't offer up your sacrifice without salt. And so here's just another brief overview of why you would offer the sacrifice with salt. First of all, in the house, in the temple, they offered they sprinkled the salt in 3 places. It makes sense. In the chamber of salt, they salted. It's called the lishka. And they would take the animal skins of the sacrifices and they would salt the animal skins in the chamber of salt. Another place where they would offer salt is on the ramp leading to the altar. As they prepared the limbs to go up onto the altar for burning, they would salt the limbs. And then the third place where they would salt is at the head of the altar. And there was a meal offering. If somebody was too poor to bring an animal sacrifice, let's say he brings a meal offering instead, he brings a mincha, then they would mix the salt with the mincha. There would be frankincense in it. And if somebody brings in, again, if they're poor and they bring a fowl instead of a lamb or whatever, as an olah offering, then they would salt that, even that bird, right? You didn't get penalized because you were poor. The offering was still mixed with salt. And the idea is that in the salting process of this covenant, the change you expect to see by bringing this animal, the change where you say, hey, look, I'm not one of those, I'm not Aziz, then I want to preserve this change. I want this to be a lasting lesson. And that's what it did. It was supposed to set or preserve, which was the goal of the sacrifice, because the salt would prevent spoilage and rotting. In the natural realm, it was seen as a sign of what you were seeking in the spiritual realm. That if there was this transformation of your soul, of your animal soul, the nefesh, then hopefully that transformation would hold. It says, so too, with the act of the offering, a man is saved from becoming spoiled. His soul will be protected and it will remain in existence forever. So that was the goal, is just offer the salt with the animal so that this transformation of soul is kind of being sealed over in a sense, or preserved until the resurrection. And the salt was important. Like you say, why salt? Well, I get that it's a preservative. Why else? Another reason is because it was pleasant. If you've ever been put on a salt restricted diet, that's when you realize how pleasant salt is and how much salt is present even when you're not putting extra salt in it. Because if you get something without salt, it's just not good. And that's what it says. Anything without salt will not be pleasing to a man, neither in its taste, not even in its aroma. And that's a continuation there, that quote from sections 118 and 119. So they're trying to explain the sacrificial process, that when this beast dies and it's preserved with salt, the principle of why you brought this animal is preserved with salt. They say the death of the beast it's not just pleasing to Adonai. He's already said it's a pleasing aroma to him, but it can also be a pleasing aroma to you. You say, well, how can it be that killing something is going to be pleasing to me? Well, again, it represents the transformation you desire in yourself. And when you see that animal go up and the salt intensifying the aroma, then it becomes pleasing to you as well, because you realize you're being forgiven. You realize that this mistake it's being atoned for. And so it just like if you put a steak on the grill, if you walk by, you don't automatically walk by and say, ooh, that smells like death. Probably, unless you're vegan, then you probably would. But most people, if they smell something on the barbecue, it smells good, but it's dead. It's a dead animal on the grill. In the case of a sacrifice, it's not just smelling good like a nice steak. It's the smell, it's the odor of repentance that is pleasing. And so the salt is seen as something that's not just external. It's seen as something internal that preserves peace through this process, peace between you and the Holy One, and being at peace with one another, because often these sins have to do with how we have wronged another person. So Paul, when he's writing to the Colossians in chapter 4, verse 6, says, your speech must always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. In other words, make a patient, considered answer, or make a patient, considered case. Don't just run out there running off at the mouth like a beast. Don't do that. Season it with salt. Because remember, the salt, it's there to preserve the change that is in you. So if Yeshua has changed you on the inside, make sure that you preserve that sacrifice with salt. And then Mark 9:50, Yeshua says, salt is good, but if the salt becomes unsalty, with what will you make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. And so Paul and Yeshua are pointing out that the salt, it was just an exterior thing, but it was supposed to make you think about the peace that this sacrifice could bring inside of you through reconciliation after repentance. So just to sum up, the sacrifice was a way of pursuing repentance and justice with Adonai, but it also, because of the salt, extended the benefits to other human beings. It preserved, especially through speech. It's usually in speech that we offend. But see, the worst abomination of the wicked lamp was one who separates brothers. And so with salt, if you season your speech with salt, then what you are doing is transforming, and you are creating this pleasant dwelling place of others through your repentance, through your sacrifice, through your saying, I will make more considered, patient choices. I will listen to the voice and I will wait for the voice of Elohim before I run out there and do the first thing somebody on the internet tells me to do, or believe the first thing somebody on the internet tells me to do. It's crazy because the internet's not even a thing if you unplug it. You know, at least the serpent was a thing. So repentance and justice, these are described as something to be smelled. It kind of goes back to the fig tree, the ripe figs, and the fragrance of the blossoming vines. This is time. It's time to arise. And repentance and justice, whether we're talking about a sacrifice seasoned with salt, or whether we're talking about those transformations that Paul is talking about that should be occurring with the sacrifice of Yeshua, that these should be preserved with salt. So people should smell repentance on us. People should smell justice coming from the inside out, is what Yeshua said. It's suggesting to us, you know, that when we look at the parable of the fig tree, as we look at those young figs coming out, as we look at the blossoming of the grapes and the fragrance that that's emitting, it's telling us that there's a higher level of our five senses. As fallen human beings, we're like the parables. That's all we have are the parables. And as you realize as you get older, some of those senses start to fail you. It's harder to taste things. It's harder to hear things. It's much harder to see things. Your senses begin to fail you, your natural senses. And if your spiritual senses are not alive, they could fade as well. we should always cultivate repentance and justice. Like Yeshua said, that salt has to come from inside you. Because if it's too linked to the natural world, it will fade with your natural senses. Instead, in our old age, he says we can be full of sap and very green. In other words, we can be those fragrant blossoms. We can be like the ripening figs from the fig tree. And we're told that Adonai, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, who is life, he's actually something we could taste. And see, if we get stuck down into the parable that we live in of our five senses, then we'll completely miss what it means to taste Adonai. Psalm 34:8 says, taste and see that the Lord is good. How blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Well, how would you take refuge in him? You would accept his sacrifice on your behalf through Yeshua. And if you do that, you can be blessed and you can actually taste him. In fact, in all four Gospels, Yeshua spoke of death as something you could taste. You say, now, wait a minute. If I'm dead, how am I going to taste it? That's what I mean. Don't confine yourself to the five senses you have in this natural world, because your soul can still taste death. But through the sacrifice of Yeshua, you don't have to taste death. You can taste the life of the Holy One. Because if you taste of life with the Holy One, even if you are dead, you will not taste it because you have taken refuge in him. And that's what Yeshua said in Matthew 16:28. He says, truly, I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The problem is they did die. Those guys did die. But Yeshua told the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and he's hinting that you've got two Israelites in the story, presumably, but they're having very different experiences after death, or we would say in death. Lazarus, it says when he was, after he died, he's taken by the angels to Abraham's bosom. He's taken to the base of the altar in the garden. The rich man died, it says, and was buried. Now, most people in the Bible, whether they're righteous or not, they are buried when they die. But I think Yeshua is making a point right here. Lazarus did not experience death like the rich man did. There's a difference in how we taste after we die. Some will taste death and some will not. They will taste life. Even if their body is dead, they will taste life. So it seems even before the burial, Lazarus is taken to Abraham's bosom, so he didn't experience the torments of death like the rich man. So when you taste something, you experience it. So what did Adam and Eve eat? They tasted death. They could have tasted life. I'm not sure if that's making a lot of sense. But this is where we find out that the words of the Torah and the words that Yeshua spoke, even if we're looking in the New Testament, don't view it as inferior, because especially when we go back into Hebrew gospel, we can see that his words are very precise. And when Yeshua says not everyone will experience death the same, he's using the Greek word for taste, and by implication to eat it, to experience it. So we look up the Hebrew cognate for that Greek word for taste. It's only going to appear once. And guess where it is? Genesis 25:30. And Esau said to Jacob, please let me have a mouthful of that red stuff there, for I am exhausted. Therefore, he was called Edom by name. He became the red one with that statement. Give me some of that red stuff. It's not just what he ate, it's the appetite with which he ate it. It was the lack of sechal, considered, careful, patient gathering of information instead of devouring like an animal, like a beast of the field. And the English translations, they kind of diminish the harshness of what it's saying in Hebrew. They're saying, please let me have a mouthful. It's almost like a whining. It's not whining. The naming of Edom is in the context with taste. So when you read it in Hebrew, you hear how strong his statement is. What he's saying there literally means, feed me like I'm an animal. Haliteni. And I put it there in Hebrew, if you can read the Hebrew, where it says, Haliteni, na, that is, please, min ha'adom, ha'adom. Hear that doubled Edom? Min ha'adom, ha'adom. This is how he's called Edom, because he wants some of that red stuff. And then it says, Kara shmo Edom. So we get Edom, Edom, Edom. This is Esau. And feed me like an animal. That's what he's saying. That's the equivalent. And you can see right here. And he even, again, there's the play on words. He says, feed me from, min, ha'adom. Remember, min in Hebrew, that's a play on word. It doesn't just mean from, like we would say mezuzah. It can mean the kind of the beast. Remember, 5 times it says after their kind. That's after their mean. After their mean. From the red. The red. If you just translate it from the red. And so his name is called Red. Because his appetite, he's devouring without consideration there for the covenant, for sure, because this is where he loses his right to the covenant. So when you devour something, haliteni, what do? You devour, you have to use a particular preposition. You have to use min in Hebrew. When you devour from. Okay, so because of time, maybe that's a good place to stop. And we can pick up with that tomorrow and go on with the difference in tasting death. And I'll mark that so I'll know where to stop tomorrow.